It's becoming a new metric of progress. So instead of just considering are we getting richer, politicians and statisticians are looking at are we in fact getting happier also.
Hi, I'm Paul, and this is Great Expectations, the Jabra podcast that explores how technology is reshaping the way we work and live. What does it really mean to be happy at work? And in a world of digital burnout, overload, and rising AI adoption, is it getting harder or easier to get there? To help answer that, I'm joined today by Meik Wiking, CEO of the Happiness Research Institute and author of global bestsellers like The Little Book of Hygge. Meik's work blends hard data with human stories, helping governments, cities, and companies design for real well-being. In this episode, we dig into what drives happiness at work, why purpose still matters, and how AI might help us focus more on what we love or risk eroding what makes us human. After months of working together, this is a podcast that I'm particularly excited for, and so thank you so much for making the time today.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
The obvious question to start with is around happiness. This is what you've devoted, I might almost say, your entire life to. But when you say happiness, what exactly are we measuring? Life evaluation, daily mood, purpose?
Yeah, all of the above. You are exactly right. Happiness is a wide, complex, subjective term. You have one perception of happiness. I have another one, which is fine in everyday conversation. But when you want to approach happiness from a scientific point of view, you need to make sure that we're actually talking about the same thing. And I like to use the analogy of the economy, because the economy is also a wide, complex term. Because when we talk about how is the Danish or the American economy doing, we would break it down into smaller components. We would talk about inflation. We would talk about tariffs. We would talk about unemployment rate, interest rates, GDP per capita, exports, the stock market. And all those metrics gives us a more precise, more nuanced language to discuss how's the Danish or American economy doing. So I think that's also what we need to do when it comes to happiness. So OECD created a guideline for measuring subjective well-being, and they advise researchers to look at least 3 different dimensions of well-being. First of all, the overall life satisfaction. How satisfied are you with your life? How happy are you overall? That's actually typically the one that goes into the World Happiness Report. Specifically, they use a question asking respondents to consider a ladder with steps from 0 to 10, and step 0 represents the worst possible life you could live. Step 10 represents the best possible life you could live. That's a very stable dimension that catches what you would imagine impacts people's lives. So disease, employment, unemployment, relationship status, but it's not influenced by what day of the week you ask people or whether it rains or the sun shines. We can see that's the case for the second dimension, which has been labeled the affective dimension, which has more to do what kind of mood do people experience in the here and now. So you could take yesterday, again, from a scale from 0 to 10, how happy were you yesterday? There you would see a lot of volatility. And we could see people are happier on Fridays than they are on Mondays and Tuesdays on that one. And of course, the first and second dimension are correlated, they're linked, because if you have a lot of everydays with positive emotions where you feel happy, you're also more likely to be satisfied with your life overall. And the third dimension builds on Aristotle's, so the Greek philosophers, his perception of the good life. And to him, the good life is the meaningful life. So do people have a sense of purpose or meaning? So we like to look at all 3 dimensions. Are people satisfied about their life? Are people happy in their life? And do they have a sense of purpose?
And you've said that, you mentioned it with sort of the analogy you give to the economy, and you've said that happiness is the new GDP. What first convinced you way back when that sort of subjective well-being deserved this type of hard measurement?
What brought me into happiness research in the first phase was actually the World Happiness Report, which first came out in 2012. So it's a UN commissioned report. And the first report, like it does every year, it gives an overview of sort of the latest research within the space. And I was really impressed with how solid and how many different fields are actually working with happiness and well-being and quality of life now. And then it also gave a sort of a ranking of happiness levels around the world, like it does every year now. And Denmark was in first place in that report, in the first one. And I just thought, isn't it interesting? Because you always see Denmark and the other Nordic countries do quite well in these livability, quality of life, happiness, well-being rankings. There should be somebody in Denmark trying to explore why that is. And then I thought, maybe I should actually try and explore that. Also because, as you allude to, it's becoming a new metric of progress. So instead of just considering, are we getting richer, politicians and statisticians are looking at, are we in fact getting happier also? And you have several countries not only collecting data quite comprehensively. I think in Europe, it's the UK that have gone the furthest in that regard. So every year, the Office of National Statistics in the UK ask 4 happiness questions to see where in the UK are people more or less happy. But you also have countries that are using happiness as the sort of one of the main political goals of the country. Of course, famously, Bhutan have navigated through gross national happiness since the beginning of the 70s. So every political decision is based on, is this going to improve quality of life for people? But even you had a country like the United Arab Emirates, one of the 10 richest countries in the world. They have their first Minister of State for Happiness and Well-being. I think she was appointed in 2015, Hud Al-Rumi, and her job was to get the UAE to the top 5 in the World Happiness Report. So I think it's interesting, rich countries are also looking at well-being as a new sort of measure of progress.
Seeing the sort of focus that it's had from that perspective where heads of state and governments are investing so heavily in it, I think in some instances, and maybe more so in work, happiness is seen as a nice to have, but not a need to have. But clearly the investment and the focus shows that there's much more than just material happiness or well-being in terms of the positive outcomes that you can get from having a society or a workforce or a family or whatever sort of nucleus you're looking at being happy. What are some of the less considered outcomes of happiness that people don't necessarily link directly to sort of the nice to have of happiness, but actually that positively floats the rest of the metrics that might sometimes get more focus?
I think there are actually several things. First of all, if people are interested in sort of talent recruitment and retention, they should be mindful of that it's becoming a new metric when people are looking for jobs. So Indeed.com, it's the biggest job site in the US. They have collected for years now and publishes them answers around happiness. I think they have 4 questions around happiness or well-being, asking current and former employees of different companies. So if I want to work as a cabin crew for an airline, I can go in and say, okay, Ryanair, their 3,000 former employees have rated Ryanair with a 3.5 out of 5 on happiness, but South by Southwest Airlines have rated them 4.7 out of 5. It doesn't mean that I'll experience a 4.7 out of 5 if I work for South by Southwest, but I think the odds are better. So I think talent will go where happiness is not only promised, but delivered. Secondly, several studies show the link between productivity and happiness among workers. So one of the most recent studies conducted in the UK among 1,800 salespeople for British Telecom in 11 different locations in the UK over 6 months, and found that happier employees, they looked at the affective dimension. So how happy have people felt in the past week? Measuring all sorts of metrics in terms of how many calls per hour, how many calls are converted to sales, and so on, found that the happier people are 13% more productive. And actually, a recent study using the Indeed.com data shows that the happier companies, the companies that have the happier employees, they outperform stock market-wise the rest of the S&P 500 index. So there's a good business case for productivity, for talent retention and recruitment, and also if you care about stockholders.
And if we look at the landscape over the last 5 years, we've had pandemic, inflation, geopolitical shocks, now the rise of AI. Have there been any sort of single changes that have most reshaped how the broad landscape of happiness is looking or how we define it?
I mean, the world has always been turbulent. And I mean, my colleague Aristotle worked with these questions 2,000 years ago, found many of the same things that we find today. People don't like uncertainty. People don't like being lonely. People don't like being poor. That was the case 2,000 years ago. That's the case today as well. The pandemic was stressful, created loneliness, it created uncertainty. And now, I mean, so many global political events are also increasing the level of uncertainty and anxiety. But I think the world has always been uncertain. And what drives happiness, I think it's the same today as it was 5, 10, 50 years ago, and will be in the next 10, 50 years as well.
And do you think with that sort of with things like cost of living worries or burnout increases, that there's sort of some type of permanent stress baseline shift that we're witnessing, or that it is actually just different stresses, but at the same level that we've had for centuries?
I think the mechanisms are the same. I think there are some fundamental challenges we have as humans when it comes to happiness, because unfortunately, I don't think we're wired to be happy. I think we're wired to be ambitious. We're the only species that will look at Mars and think, how do we get people up there? And that's exciting as a species to constantly raise the bar or sort of push the boundaries for what we can achieve. But it doesn't necessarily provide a good foundation for happiness, because in happiness research, we often talk about something called the hedonic treadmill, which means that we as humans constantly raise the bar for what we feel we need in order to be happy. So, people are happy when they get a pay raise, and then 3, 4, 6 months afterwards, certainly 12 months afterwards, we would like another 10%. Additionally, for example, when it comes to income, we can see that people not only care about their absolute income, they care about their relative income. So how much money do I make compared to my peers, to my reference group? I think it's an American saying that a happy man is a man that makes $100 more than his wife's sister's husband. And we can to some extent see that in the data. So if you ask people, would you rather make 50,000 US in a country where everybody else makes 25,000? Or would you rather make $100,000 where everybody else makes 200,000? Roughly 50% of people will go for option 1, because it's also about the position in the socioeconomic hierarchy. So we're becoming richer, but if everybody is becoming richer, then I'm still in the same place in the economic hierarchy. And then, yes, I can buy more stuff, but maybe we have reached, at least in a lot of countries, maybe we have reached peak stuff for happiness. There's no more one thing I can buy that's going to bring me additional happiness.
And this is probably a reason that the Nordics are so frequently spotlighted and championing happiness indexes as the top leaders usually. You've written extensively about this, but what are some of the lessons of living Danishly or living like a Scandinavian? Because some people have said it's not about being happier, it's about being more content with what you have. And so it's sort of about the framing of it. And like you just gave with that example of, would you rather have $50,000 when everybody else has 25 or 100 when everybody else has 200? It is really about that anchoring bias and how you frame it. But within the Nordic perspective and your extensive studies on what it is that is driving this type of success, what are some of the core findings that you would almost advise every other head of state to say, these are the ways you can move more towards happier workforces, happier societies?
If we look at happier societies, I think the Nordic model, what explains why all the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, do well in the happiness rankings, is that the Nordic model is fairly good at reducing sources of unhappiness. So progressive taxation, channeling money from the richest to the poorest, that is going to raise the bottom. And these indexes are based on averages. So it brings up the bottom, and that's why these countries often come out on top. But there's also good governance, low corruption, high level of trust and trustworthiness. So trust is also a field that have been researched quite well and linked with well-being in different countries. So one study took 17,000 wallets containing cash and ID papers and dropped them on streets, in museums, in kindergartens. And then they saw how many of these wallets are returned to the owner with the cash still in them. And in Helsinki, Finland, 9 out of 10 wallets are returned with the cash still in them. So there's also a level of kindness or benevolence, trustworthiness that comes into play. And of course, some of these things it takes a long time to build and can be easily destroyed. But it's a complex, I think, ecosystem. And then you can go into the city design as well, or the architecture of happiness. I think what makes Copenhagen a city with a high quality of life is that it, to some extent, removes the price tag there is on happiness, that you can enjoy a relatively high quality of life, whether you're rich or poor. Millionaires and people who are unemployed, they get around the city the same way because it's fast and easy and fun to ride your bicycle. So it's a complex system, but I think that's also what makes it fun to research.
And now if we shift sort of the lens onto work specifically, it's a necessity for billions of people around the world. If we're talking about zooming in on knowledge workers, people who might be going into any type of office setting, that's still in the hundreds of millions, if not billions. And there is this really strong link that we've seen between work happiness and that spilling over into life happiness. So can you shed any light for us on why work is such a dominant happiness engine in the 21st century?
If you look at employment, there is no question that people who are employed are more satisfied with life. They enjoyed yesterday more, and they have a stronger sense of purpose or meaning in life. So all the dimensions we talked about in the beginning, they come out on top among people who are employed. But if you look at people who are employed and you ask them at random moments throughout the week, how happy do you feel right now? They typically report the lowest levels when they are working, which is unfortunate. But I mean, we can also see that work can and should be a source of happiness if you design it right. Because what does work provide, you ask? And what actually comes to mind is a post-it I saw. So here in Copenhagen, we created a happiness museum. And my favorite room in the museum is where we have asked people to write down on post-its what happiness is to them. And there was somebody who wrote, happiness is a quality lawnmower and a big lawn to mow. And I think it's because we like to see progress. We like to achieve things. And I think that's one of the things we get out of work. What we also get out of work is we form a lot of meaningful relationships. We work on exciting problems. It provides structure to our day. It provides identity. So, when you meet people, one of the first questions is, what do you do? And we can also see when we follow people over time and ask them year after year, how satisfied are you with life? One of the biggest setbacks is when people become unemployed. Because yes, we lose our income, but we also lose our identity and some of the relationships we have in life. We can also see in this study, people who enjoy work, people who are satisfied with work, are also more satisfied with life in general. And it's because we don't shut down part of ourselves when we go or leave work. I'm Meik, whether I'm working or whether I'm off work. And if I had a great day at work, my evening will also be better because I achieved something that day. So they're linked. And we can also see, I think, in this study that if you have a high level of well-being at work, you are 4.5 times more likely to be satisfied with life, which is great. And it's a real power to have, I think, as an employer, that you can not only influence people's job satisfaction, but actually their life satisfaction. That's a powerful position to be in.
From that angle, where does stress play into things? Because I think stress is far more nuanced than the knee-jerk reaction that we have to it being entirely negative. But like you say, if you have that purpose and you care greatly and deeply for your job, then the highs are high, but the lows are also low. How do we try and reframe stress and know when it's something that is negative or needs to be controlled or contained, and when it can actually be a powerful driver of positive outcomes or a byproduct of great care and purpose that one might have in their job?
That was, I think, one of the more exciting things about the result of this study was, I think we write that in the report, that not all stress is created equal. A lot of people are experiencing stress, or a study is also finding that, but we can also see that the happier employees are not the ones that are not feeling stress at all. Actually, of course, yes, a lot of stress is bad for happiness at work, but a little stress is actually good. So finding that sweet spot is key. And of course, that's a real challenge. But I think we also know it from our personal lives. If we don't have anything to do, or if what we do is not challenging enough, we become bored. There was a psychologist called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi who coined the term flow, which is a pleasant state to be in, where we get sort of instant feedback, where we lose our sense of self and a sense of time. It's something that athletes experience often. I also experience it when I play tennis or when I spearfish. I'm sort of in the zone, in flow, which is actually a really pleasant state to be in because, the voice in the back of my head questioning whether I do things good enough is silent. So I think having a challenge, something where I find it interesting and fun to try and solve, that works well for me, as we can see through this study, evidently also for a lot of other people. A little stress seems to be good for people's well-being at work.
And now if we kind of shift squarely to the study and the changes that we're seeing, maybe anecdotally, maybe also from the data set around AI's impact on the workforce, you could see a scenario in which right now there's a decent amount of discovery and excitement and intrigue. There's AI assistance to humans, but it could be a situation where in 5 or 10 years' time, we're managing teams of agents rather than teams of people, and there's a lot of oversight, and we almost have this job shock or identity crisis. But on the other side, it could end up being a fantastic tool of augmentation, one in which we think will remove the mundane, drive higher purpose in jobs, and ultimately lead to a much happier workforce. What are some of the early signals that you've gotten from these findings tell you about where you think we might be going?
We find that AI adaptation is still in its early days. And as we also write in the report, there's mixed emotions. One of the questions was to have people write down what words come to mind when we talk about AI and work in the future. And I think the results could be the same results as if we had asked people what comes to mind if you see a really fast roller coaster, because it's exciting and it's anxious and it's curious. So at a high level, we could see people who are frequent, so daily users of AI are among the happier workers. But at the same time, they were also the ones that were more concerned about becoming unemployed in the future. My hope is that AI will become a tool where I can sort of outsource to AI the boring part of my work and keep what excites me. I also use other tools. I use autocorrect, right? Or auto spelling. I'm a writer. I write books. Finding my spelling mistakes is not what excites me. It's creating sentences that illustrates ideas and stories and bringing those to life. That's what excites me. My hope is also that AI will be that in the future, a companion and an assistant. And I think that's also the hope that is shared among the 3,700 knowledge workers that we surveyed in this study.
And when it comes down to it, there seems to be a decent amount of AI optimism. And like you say, this really positive signal that those who are using AI more seem to be more fulfilled, broadly speaking, with their work. Some of the concerns that came up were really around how all this transformation and change management is communicated more than the necessary outcomes, or it's less about where we're going, but how much we are confident in the way that the journey is being communicated. What are some of your takeaways on advice to leadership for navigating this?
You're right, that there is optimism among the workers. I think it was 45% of the people we surveyed expected AI to make work more enjoyable, and 10 to 15% that would make work less enjoyable. What they also articulated was that management should communicate and ensure transparency and not be so afraid of not delivering perfection. Nobody knows where this is going to go. And I think that's fine to admit. Remaining silent, I think, is the wrong strategy. Addressing that we don't have a perfect plan right now, but here are our thoughts around the field and having a dialogue with the employees around this. That would be my advice.
If you were to combine, like you say, the last 12 years worth of happiness research with this increasing integration of technology into our lives, whether that's in our personal lives, with social media, with keeping up with friends and family, with digesting news, we're so in touch with technology every day, and it seems set to only continue with the rise of AI. But against a backdrop of 12 years of happiness research and the constant flood of tips like avoid screens for 2 hours before bed and make sure that you get X, Y, or Z well-being boosters, what would you say in your experience cuts through the noise as sort of a daily trend or a weekly trend towards happiness?
In Denmark, we often talk about something called the ABC for mental health. It's actually an Australian university that coined it, and ABC stands for Act, Belong, Commit, and sort of roughly translate into doing something active, doing something together with other people where you belong, and doing something meaningful, whatever that means to you, whether it's religion or growing a vegetable garden, and ideally something where you achieve all things at once. So during the pandemic, for example, we would go to a forest, my friends and I, we could spread out and look for edible mushrooms. So we're outside, we're active, we're being together, we're looking for food. Those would be one of the activities that tick all three categories.
If you were giving advice to your younger self or someone who was on the cusp of exploring university, figuring out what they wanted to do in life, there's been a lot of talk around find something that makes you happy and you'll never work a day in your life. On the flip side of that, there's cost of living crises. There's people who sort of say that it's impossible to find work that's happy. And ultimately, if you're working a job that has very low security or in which you really struggle to make ends meet, your core happiness markers are going to be quite low because of the stress that comes with that. And so then some people take the avenue of, I'll just study a degree or pursue a career that I know I might not like or get fulfillment from, but it will ultimately provide the core securities I need to have a baseline of happiness. What advice would you give to someone on balancing those different sides of the coin?
First, I get that tyranny of choice or choice anxiety that people experience when they have to pick whatever line of profession they want to go into. I had the same when I was 19, 20. Doctor, lawyer, I was all over the place. One study looked at a supermarket and had a stand in the supermarket where you could try 6 different kinds of jam. And you got a $1 discount if you tried the jam. And at other times in the same supermarket, the same stand, but now 24 different kinds of jam. And again, you get a $1 discount if you buy one of these jams that you try. And then they saw how many people actually use these coupons, how many people buy once they've tried 6 jams and 24 jams. So if you have 24 jams, 3% end up buying something. When you have 6 jams, 30% buy something. Because if there's 24 jams, I don't know what is the perfect jam for me. Is it the strawberry rhubarb or is it the gooseberry? I don't know. So I'd rather not make a choice. So there is that. So actually fewer choices are sometimes good for people. And secondly, maybe we need to be prepared that where we find meaning and where we find a source of income is not necessarily going to come from the same source in the future. We also have countries now experimenting with universal basic income. I know Finland have done some experiments in this. And I think it's really interesting to follow the FIRE movement, which is big in the US. So for people who don't know the FIRE movement, it stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. So people who are aggressive savers, live really frugally and invest their income to eventually retire when they're 30 and live off the dividends or income they have from their investments. What is interesting about that movement from a happiness point of view is that a lot of these people, even though they are financially independent, continue to work. Because after 6 months on a beach, you're bored. And you want to achieve stuff and you want to do stuff. So I'm not sure it's an advice. Maybe I'm just making the people picking their profession more confused. But here we are.
It's like 2 roads that ultimately you could argue lead to happiness. The one in which you choose the thing that feels like the higher purpose or your calling. But like you say, that's even harder now than ever because of this decision paralysis on any number of endless careers. It's not as linear and defined as sort of the lawyer, the doctor, or the accountant. And then on the other hand, the path to happiness that you achieve through not necessarily finding purpose and meaning in your work, but through finding financial security and setting yourself up to find that meaning and purpose elsewhere in your life. So I don't think there's necessarily a right answer, but it's a good conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today, Meik. It's been a really insightful conversation, and I think a necessary one to have that's often overlooked within a workplace setting.
Thanks, Paul.
And that's it for this episode of Great Expectations. If you want to find out more information about implementing the right AI solutions in your workplace, see more episodes, or find our latest research, go to jabra.com. I'm Paul. Thanks for listening.